Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to 1% Better, where we take a look at hidden stories in sport. I'm Xylon, and I'm joined, as always, by Dr. David Lipman. Your medical question today to the doctor is, during an endurance exercise in warm conditions, why does your heart rate keep rising, even if pace or power stays exactly the same?
Well, there's actually more than one reason. They're going to say it's dehydration, or that's what ChatGPT is going to say, is because you're getting dehydrated. There are other reasons. Stress hormones, which are related, is another reason. Um, yeah, it's complex. The body's a lot more complex than ChatGPT thinks. Let's put it that way.
How do you know I'm using ChatGPT for this?
Oh, okay. What were you using?
So this is what ChatGPT says. The answer is because of cardiovascular drift. As you sweat, plasma volume drops, stroke volume decreases, and the heart compensates by beating faster to maintain cardiac output. Rising core temperature adds extra strain.
I mean, they said so. So the answer to why does your heart rate go up is your heart rate goes up. That's what they said. That's what cardiovascular drift is. Then they explained cardiovascular drift, which is fine, and they did a pretty good job of it. So yeah. Anyway, yes, mate. Stress hormones are part of it as well, etc., etc., etc. Heat is certainly part of it. Yeah.
We
Yes.
are supported by Precision Fuel and Hydration on this podcast. Did I see correctly? Have they published a case study on their 1,000 electrolytes?
No, 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 no. They have 1,000 case studies published.
Well, you can see how I'm going to
We're going
edit
to talk
this.
about.
I'm
We're
going
going
to
to
edit
talk.
this.
No, no, we're not. Leave this in. We're going to talk about why you're like this because I think this is important. They published 1,000 case studies, which is unbelievable how much learning there is there. It's worthwhile going to dig through some of them. I found them to be quite interesting. I actually used them recently for a presentation I gave. I used a couple of them, and I'm actually one of them. My London Marathon. I was there.
Oh,
They
wow.
said you barely drank anything, and I said correct. And they said you need to drink more, and I said okay, and I didn't. But anyway, uh, here we are. Here we are, mate. You're super washed out. Tell us why you're so washed out, mate.
Yeah, if I'm feeling a little flat, it's because I had a stomach bug on my birthday 2 days ago.
Did you
And I've
have a
actually
stomach
been
bug, mate, or did you have food poisoning?
sorry, had food poisoning by being an amateur and buying sushi at the grocery store. So there's a lesson I didn't need to learn. But I've actually been
Right.
taking Precision Fuel and Hydration 1500 electrolytes since it's weird. I had to use the loo at 3 a.m. in the morning to do what you do when you have food poisoning. And the first thought in my mind was precision electrolytes, get to the precision electrolytes. And I've been downing that the last 2 days to try to put me back together. By the way, if you want to check out Precision Fuel and Hydration, we do have a discount code for you, 15% off on your first purchase. That discount code is 1PB2025. That's the number 1PB2025. We also have a direct link in the show notes below. But yeah, that's me. That's why I've been feeling so flat. So it's going to take a lot to get me through this episode. You also said, what should I take? A lot of V vitamins, a lot of C vitamins. Is that right?
Yeah, B and C vitamins will probably help you feel a little bit better when you lose a bunch of. Yeah, when you've been a bit unwell, they'll often help a little bit, particularly if you've lost a bunch of water. So when you get food poisoning or gastro, you tend to lose fluid, right? Through whatever means. We don't need to be graphic about it, but you lose fluid. And B and C vitamins are water soluble. And I don't necessarily think they move with it, but I think it's worthwhile replacing them as well anyway and seeing how you go. They're also quite safe, as I said to you before, because they are water soluble. You'll just excrete what you don't use, which is where the expensive urine statement comes from. That's in contrast to something like the fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and vitamin K, where if you take too much, you store that in fat. So you sort of there's no mechanism to excrete those, whereas tons of mechanisms to excrete, or at least a significant mechanism to excrete B and C vitamins. So yeah, it's a low risk strategy. Often you'll feel a little bit better if you're a bit run down. The B vitamins are pretty important in metabolism.
Cool. I think I will head straight out the door after this and go get some because when I was staying with you last week in London, you did give me some, and I don't know if it was a placebo effect, but it did make me feel better. That's for sure. I feel like all I've been doing the last few months in this podcast is complain about how not well I'm doing. So new listeners who have been coming in must be like, this guy is so dramatic. This guy's such a downer. If you want,
The, ter-
go
the
back about
term is
18 months and
the term is wet blanket, mate.
yeah. Well, if you want a different island, go back about 18 months where I was running ultra marathons and doing Ironmans and loving life a lot more. But what's up with you? I heard you had a long run with an Irish physio in the last few
Well,
days.
the Irish physio, mate. The Irish physio, Aiden. So now we got out for a run yesterday. He's rehabbing Achilles, and so he's got to an hour run. And so I ran a little bit more, met him, then did a run, and then ran home from there. So I ended up doing about 20 Ks, which was nice. It was really good. We did about 13, 14 together, which was really nice. Grabbed a coffee afterwards. Felt good. Felt like an athlete, mate. Felt like I was a runner again, solving the problems of the world. Lots of running chat. So no, it was really nice. So I appreciated the run there.
Were you using stride metrics during that run?
I I was actually. I always use Stride. The Stride just live on my shoes, and they just switch between shoes because it's such a smart design like that. But it was interesting for me to look at my metrics across the run to see how they went because I haven't been running that far, right? I've been running 16, 18 Ks maybe, and mostly on the treadmill. So to go outside and run this, I was like, oh, let's see how we go. And I spent some time digging into on the power center, and I could see myself deteriorating a little bit. So like my ground contact time went from like 240 to 250 ish, like 240, 250 to up to 260, 270 milliseconds. So it's not a huge change, but I was on the ground longer, which is not ideal. You don't want to be on the ground. That's not how we run. So and then my leg spring stiffness also went down, which would make sense in that context, right? So I'm springing off the ground less. So that went from 12.18 kilonewtons per meter in the first half to 11.76 kilonewtons per meter in the second half, which is about 4%, which isn't a massive amount. And then my vertical oscillation dropped for about 3 centimeters. And that's generally not a bad thing. That probably goes with the other two, probably aligns with that. And it's kind of what we were talking about the other week when we were talking about how Stride was used for durability in the marathon. And this is probably similar. And then my impact loading rate was pretty much the same. So, it was just interesting for me to see all that data live, and it was pretty much from a heart rate standpoint all pretty easy. So it was quite interesting to see that physically I was breaking down more than aerobically, which would make sense in the context of the heat training I've been doing and all the other things.
By the way, if you'd like to check out Stride and be like David, we've got good news for you. Stride are running a Black Friday special. They have 10% off the new Stride 5.0. Which one are you using? Which pods are you using?
I'm using the 4.0, the previous ones. I need to chat to the guys and see if they'll be kind enough to send me a 5, but I don't have 5s yet. So yeah, but also if you do go by Stride, please follow the link in our show notes to go there. That'll show that you came from us, which is super helpful to us to show Stride that our listeners are the ones buying, not just not random people.
Should we get through some community shoutouts? The first one being Boris Cortez, who went 122.46 at High Rocks Dallas. I think he commented on our Strava community group,
He
which we
did.
haven't pushed for a while, I think.
Yeah, no, he put up a discussion there and he says this is making me a hybrid athlete, and I thought it was quite funny. He's a funny guy, Boris. Good sense of humor. So, I mean, the thing that struck me most from that was that he was wearing a shirt. So I can't work out if that meant that he went quicker because he was the only one wearing a shirt, or if they docked him time because you're not really allowed to wear shirts at High Rocks. I can't work it out. But anyway, 122 is pretty impressive, Boris. So well done, and glad you're enjoying the High Rocks stuff. Also wanted to shout out Alistair Courtney. He got fifth at Run Through London 10 mile in 58 minutes 45, which is pretty slick. I think that was on some dirt paths. I think it was over in from memory, it was over near Hackney Marshes in one of the parks over there. So I don't think that was on road. So it's pretty slick if it wasn't on road, particularly because it would have been a bit wet yesterday.
Big shout out as well to Christian Trampedach in the Milan half marathon, went 70:48 there. That's in prep of for Malaga Marathon in 3 weeks' time. And Barney Day at Kent Masters cross country. He went fourth there as well. So shout out to you, Barney.
Yeah, it's great work. And then best wishes to John Bichette Sharp. He's got a bit of a niggle, and he was planning on running Valencia, so he's still making decisions around whether he'll run or not, and that's just a horrible place to be. So, obviously, by the time he listens to this, he may not have run Valencia. It's hard to know, but yeah, fingers crossed there, and hopefully he gets to run it, and hopefully he enjoys it. And then also just a note that Matt Marquardt was meant to run Cozumel Iman Kuzmel yesterday and didn't. He was a DNS, and I sent him a text to check if he was okay. He said he's okay, but he just couldn't race. He's got a bit of a niggle, so he's going to have to work out what he does with that. So he's a bit disappointed not to race, but yeah, otherwise well.
I don't know if that should be or if it should be in the doctor's office. Put Matthew Marquardt, put the doctor in the doctor's office.
Well, I don't want to share his medical information. If I didn't speak to him about speaking about this live on the podcast, so I just checked up on him for other reasons to see how he was doing, because I noticed he was training, but in Cozumel. I noticed he was at Cozumel doing media, and then I noticed he trained, but he wasn't in the race. And I was like, well, I don't understand what's happening. So I sent him a text to check up and see how he's doing.
No, he did subsequently put out an Instagram post saying why I didn't start. Apparently, he has something to do with his hip, a niggle in his hip.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. That's what he said to me as well. So, yeah.
We are sponsored by Core Body Temperature Sensors. Now, many of you would have heard that the last few weeks in the podcast, and we've got excellent news. If you've been inquisitive about Core, they are running a Black Friday special through to the 1st of December 2025. Core has a message for you. They say, don't waste this indoor season. They have discounts coming up from now until 1 December. That is 20% off on the Core 2 and 50% off on the Core 1, as well as a bundle of Core 2 plus the Polar VS heart rate monitor for just, David, I can't understand your handwriting. What is plus 30 minutes? Just remember what question I had for you now.
Yeah, I couldn't work this out either. This has come directly from them, so I don't know what that is. I think it might be 30%. I'm not too sure here. You'd have to have a bit of a look there. That one goes until Christmas. That core, the sort of heart rate monitor plus the Core 2, but the other ones are until the 1st of December. So have a look on the website. That'll be there. Again, please do follow the link in our show notes. That way, again, that sale and that sort of traffic gets attributed to us. So yeah, it's up to you which one you buy. The big difference between them is their physical form factor. The Core 1 slides, sort of slips on with a different mechanism than the Core 2 does. But in terms of the tech and the hardware, as I understand it, they're largely the same. So I use a Core 1. You could go for either. Either would make sense. Depends really on your appetite for cost, really.
Right. Let's get through some quick bits. Have a look at what's been happening in the sporting world the last couple of days. LeBron James has made his return after an injury-delayed start to his season. Do you know what injury he had?
I don't actually. I don't remember what he had. It was some niggle he'd picked up, I think, late last year. But I noted this because the stats come up every year. It's just absurd. It's his 23rd season. They're a 20-year-old. He's been playing. He's been playing longer than people who've been voting for 4 years.
He's 40 years old now.
Yes, yep, he is. He's played with his son as well, which is crazy to think about. He's the first player to score 40 points against all 30 teams, which is just insane. And because he's had to move, obviously he's had to move teams to do that. There's conflicting numbers on this, but he's played against somewhere between 35 and 36% of all players in NBA history. I know we've talked about this before, but it never stops being wild to me that, like, of all the NBA players ever, LeBron's played against over a third of them. The league started before, like,
what is that?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. The league was going, I can't even. Anyway, this also brought up the thought around the GOAT and GOAT debates. And someone we know once brought up to us, like, the problem with these debates is that they're debated about different things. So there's this, like, some people argue it's about the peak, so how good they were at their peak. Some people argue it's about their longevity. And some people argue about things like it's how clutch they are. And those three things are not the same. So like when it comes to longevity, LeBron wins this thing hands down. There's no questions asked, right? But it's like, is his peak as good? Was he as clutch, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I'm not going into this. I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't really care too much for who's the best. I think it's just the thing people are going to remember with LeBron is like he's not going to be around in a few years. Like enjoy it because without him, the league will be very different, and that's fine. That's okay as well.
Yeah, what a player. What a man. I've spent the last couple of days on the weekend watching cricket, the Ashes first test.
No,
And
you didn't,
I'm
because it
glad I
wasn't on
watched
on
it
the
when I
weekend,
did
mate.
because,
It wasn't on the weekend. It stopped. It was done. It was
oh,
done
I don't
by
know about
early
I don't know
Saturday.
about you. My weekend starts on a Friday, but yes, I did watch it Friday and Saturday. And I actually had an interview with someone in Australia, a Canadian who's been living in Australia forever. And I said to him, "Hey, I almost missed this interview with you now because been so glued to the Ashes. Like, do you watch cricket?" And he was like, "No, mate, no, I'm not that Australian yet. I couldn't care less about cricket." But yeah, the Ashes, well done, Australia. It was over before it started.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good lesson in not throwing too many stones when any one team's batted. You don't know how the pitch is going to go, right? The Aussies were up and about because they bowled England out pretty cheaply, and then they got bowled for less. So it's worthwhile knowing, like, yeah, so I'll talk to you quickly. I mean, ultimately they came out and the pitch looked to have improved significantly. It does bring up some interesting things, though. Like the pressure's obviously on the English. Like it'll be hard for them from here. Um, but also, there was a lot of stones thrown at the Indian pitches a couple of years ago, and how like the tests weren't going 5 days. So like, there's been a couple of barbs coming back, and I think that's important, right? Like, you can't be a hypocrite about it. And yeah, okay, the pitch has settled down, but it was pretty volatile for the first couple of days. Interestingly, though, the English decided to bat first, and the Australians said they would have done the same thing, which is wild because it's the wrong decision. So it's so fascinating. Like we really don't understand how the pitches work too much, apparently.
No, that's something I've always wondered. But when I think back to this, I just think about Stuart Broad sitting in the commentary box next to Matthew Hayden. Matthew Hayden obviously celebrating and going nuts, and Stuart Broad just sitting there going like, "Someone get me out of here! This is hell. This is a living hell."
Yeah, well,
Um,
I'm
oh,
I'm stoked that happened because Haydos is a great guy and Stuart Broad is a bit of a villain in Australia. So yeah,
that's not the word you used off air to me. Use the word that you
correct.
used. Use the real word
I,
you want to use.
no, I gotta put my I
People
gotta
get
put my
to
manners in. I gotta put my manners in publicly, mate.
Yeah, people need to know there's a on-air Dr. David and there's an off-air Dr. David and the language you use.
Just
I don't think many
just
people
just
would
like
disagree with you.
everybody else, though. Like we've all got public personas, private personas, work personas, etc. I remember once on the pediatrics ward swearing and getting my boss looking at me like, "You can't do that here." And so there's a level of honesty. There's also a level of like we're going to put our manners in.
Yeah, no. Did you get to watch the box game on the weekend, the Springboks playing Ireland? Man, that is the most bizarre game of rugby I've ever watched as it pertains to refereeing. The amount of yellow cards in that game, just insane.
Yeah. So I watched the game. Yes, I watched a lot of rugby over the weekend, and that was by far the most bizarre game of rugby that's probably ever happened. Everybody said it who played. I've been watching rugby for a long time, 30 years plus, and I agree with that. Like it's bizarre. Um, this brought up the thought of refereeing in general, though, to me. And there was a lot of referees stuff to talk about refereeing wise over the weekend. Firstly, Holly Davidson, she's a fairly young Scottish lady, became the first woman to referee an All Blacks game, which is super cool. It's super cool for her. She did a really good job too. She did a really good job refereeing that game. She's already refereed in the Rugby World Cup, and she did the final for the Women's Rugby World Cup. So she's on a great trajectory here. Yeah, really impressed. She did like I just wanted to give that a bit of a shout out. In the Box Island match, as you said, Matthew Carley refereed it. Matthew doesn't do well. I texted an Irish guy when Kalen Doris was like early in the game, sort of into Matthew a little bit, and I just said to him like, "Mate, Doris can't piss him off because it'll be a problem for him." And it's very clear. Like Carly's a bit of a school teacher type, like very authoritarian, gets very stroppy, and so like it was quite interesting to watch how many yellow cards he gave out. And there's certainly some ways he could have managed this, but it brought me up. I've been thinking about this a lot. What he ended up doing was making every decision in a vacuum, which is in this specific incident, what's the call to make? And he made each decision, right? He didn't make it with reference to what else has happened in the game, previous decisions, the context of the match, etc. And
Is that good or bad?
well, this is what I've been getting to. I don't know if it's good or bad. So I don't think either extreme is the right one, because if you miss a bunch of calls or you decide not to make these calls because of it does, because of the where we are in the game, then one fan group will always lose their mind. But I think there's probably somewhere that you have to, maybe it's 75% in a vacuum, 25% in the context of the game or not. I know in certain aspects, particularly in the NRL and rugby league, they talk a lot about like the context of the game, and you need to make decisions in the context of the game rather than in a vacuum. I mean, rugby union is very different. It's regulated differently. The rules or the laws are different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just an interesting thought here is like, do we want them to make decisions in a vacuum or not? And how happy would we be in that context? So yeah, it was a bizarre match. But yeah, that sort of came up to me, and he lost control very clearly. It was very clear to me he'd lost control, particularly the second half. The scrum was a real mess, and he was really struggling with it. So, um, yeah,
Well,
not great
Ireland, just
there.
a quick question. You know a lot about rugby. Ireland messing up the scrum continually on there, and they were amazing in defence several times, preventing
They were
tries
unbelievable.
right on their try line. Were they creating penalties on purpose in the scrum when they were so
No,
close to their try line?
absolutely not. So
Okay.
at every, you don't want to give away penalties there. So at every scrum, you could probably blow a penalty either way. Is the first thing, and most people would agree with that. Everyone's trying to mess each other up all the time, so like it's a messy part of the game. It's certainly an argument. I don't think we should remove the scrum from the game, but there's certainly an argument that that's the reason why, is that it's all cheating all the time. The box scrum was just dominant. Like that's just what happened, and then they really struggled. And then like there's also like a psychological aspect to it. Is once the box start dominating, then every time there's a penalty, you just blow up for the box because they're the dominant scrum, right? So there's aspects of that for sure. Um, there are no moral victories in sport, and but the Irish would be pretty happy. They were down to 12 men defending for ages and got very close. So it's one of the few matches where I think the Irish are like, yeah, we lost that, but I'd be pretty okay with it, particularly in that they had to cope, they had to adjust, had to do all those things. And you can't simulate that in training. So when it comes to the next World Cup, they're going to be uniquely placed in many ways to deal with that stuff. So, there's some real value in that from a coach. You just go like, boys, all right, we lost that one, but there's a lot of value here, or we've got lots of good lessons here, and I'm proud of how we did X, Y, and Z, right? So again, no moral victories, but still, you'd be pretty happy there. I was pretty impressed. I watched the French game, a little bit of the French game versus Australia. Luke Pearce, the referee, who's one of the better refs. I really like Luke Pearce. He was speaking French, which is unbelievable. He's like refereeing the French in French and the Australians in English, which is really hard to do. But started speaking French to the French five, who happens to have been born in Australia, grew up in Ipswich, like the most Australian guy ever. So it's quite interesting to hear him like speaking busted French to this guy who probably doesn't speak a great deal of French. Um,
That's
but
hilarious.
this all brought up like the thought of referees in the world, and certainly in sport. And there's a great podcast called Against the Rules with Michael Lewis, who wrote The Big Short and a few others, Moneyball. And yeah, he talked about the impact of referees in society, particularly, and there's one on sport there. So I'd go check that out if you're interested in a podcast on the space, which is cool. But it also like brought up to me this thought of like, if you're Andy Farrell, the Irish coach, and you lose that match, say he was a risk of losing his job, and then you lose it like that, then you look at the referee and you go like, what are we doing, mate? And this happened to me when I was coaching. I didn't lose my job in the end, but I was under a lot of pressure, and this guy basically made a meal of the rules. Like he got it wrong. And I went to him after the game and spoke to him about it. He's like, no, I was right. And then I said, no, but this happened. He went, oh, wait, you're right. I'm so sorry. And I went, well, that's not helpful, is it, mate? I said, I might not have a job next week, and you get to say sorry. Thanks,
Yeah,
mate. And he
yeah.
was like, I don't know what to say. And I was like, I said, I don't know what to say either, mate. But like, you were pretty rough. I said, like, I asked you before the game, like, I highlighted 5 things to you. You missed a couple of them. This happened as I said it would to you, and then we ended up with this situation that you didn't manage properly. So
Was this in the
yeah,
Netherlands? And you say you
it
didn't get
was.
fired?
No, I didn't get fired from certainly not at that point. Well, I didn't get fired in the end anyway. That role ended in a mixture of COVID and me being willing to step away because of stressful situations like that. But I was under the pump. There's no question we weren't playing well. Well, actually we were playing all right. We weren't winning, and that's always hard. So yeah, it was. Yeah, I still remember that day and that ref and the situation. So yeah, still scarred from it.
Let's switch to endurance sports. We're always talking about the evolution of endurance training. I think you found a brand new paper with regards to that. This paper is called Perspectives of World Class Endurance Coaches on the Evolution of Athlete Training and Performance. Can we do a bit of a deeper dive into this?
Yeah, we talked about a paper that was really similar to this a little while ago from a similar author group. So I don't want people to get mixed up. I don't remember exactly when that was. My apologies. For a while when we were podcasting, I can remember exactly what we talked about when and give dates and all that stuff. And I'm struggling more and more, as we near 100 episodes. So my apologies to the listeners there. But we have spoken about something similar previously. But basically, what they do is they get a bunch of the world's top scientists. I think previously they did like exercise scientists. This is coaches specifically, and they send them a survey, and then they collate the results. And so this was 73 men and 5 women, representing 14 endurance sports, 18 countries. And it was a digital survey with open-ended questions looking for trends and projected future developments. And basically, like 8 themes came out of this, which was quite cool. And to be honest, this didn't surprise me at all. I read all of these and went, "Yup, that's exactly right." But it's nice to see it put into one paper. So the first one was individualized and sport specific training strategies. So, firstly, it's no longer a cookie cutter program, or it shouldn't be. And we're seeing countries and places that do that to be less successful than countries that don't do that, or at least proportionately so. And this speaks to also like training for the demands of the event. It's no longer general training, it's getting more and more specific and dialed in. Triathlon's probably the best example of this. And then there's precision in training execution. So this is really just about like getting it right in terms of the goals of the training session. And so they're measuring loads internally and externally and making sure they're correct. Um, then there's load management principles. So again, or procedures. Similar story is that we're tracking a bunch of metrics, ensuring that people are tolerating load, not just that we're applying it. Because remember, it's not about the load that you can do, it's about the load you can adapt to. So it's really about making sure that people are adapting to their loads. Is that enough? How have they responded to that? Have we overcooked it? Should we draw it back, etc.? Strategic use of environmental stresses was the fourth one. So this is, I mean, we talk about a ton about heat. There's also altitude, of course. You could look at other aspects as well, but it's predominantly heat and altitude. So where are we using these? How are you using them in the context of the year? So again, for both of these, they pretty much they start to dissociate internal and external loads, right? So that instead of them being paired as they would at sea level and temperate conditions, you start to dissociate them. The central cardiovascular load becomes more than the peripheral musculoskeletal load. So you use those during times of perhaps injury or taper, or indeed early in the season, right? So this is where we're using them and how do we use them. Then there's optimized nutrition was number 5. This is things like carb periodization, supplementation with things like bicarb, etc. Which again, this stuff's never been bigger. Holistic recovery practices. So this more alluded to less about what they were doing and more about the acknowledgement that recovery is more than just physical. So they talked a bit more about stress management and that sort of thing. Number 7 was health and injury prevention. And I think this is probably like one of the more important things we could do, because so much of injury risk is about previous injury, and so much of success is about injury free time. Now we're starting to really get proactive on this. And this will include things like strength training, injury prevention routines, and then attention to female specific needs, right? So thinking about things like pregnancy and menstrual cycles and all these sort of things in that context. Number 8, equipment and technology driven innovation. I think this is the easy one to point out, right? So it's more tech to measure and track things, technological advances in equipment, monitoring tools, support performance, injury prevention, and training capacity. So like this is super shoes, this is all sorts of other gadgets that are measuring and tracking things. So, and I think if this is where we're heading, and it is, or it's where we are, and we're probably going to keep heading this way, you're going to see two things, or you're going to see the pattern that we always, or that I talked about before in this podcast, which is initially it's about talent, talent wins, and then you have the best systems and training, and then that will win for a period of time, and then eventually everyone starts to level up, and then it becomes about talent and training. And I think at the moment what we're seeing is the technology and systems leveling a talent gap a little bit, and in some contexts, talented individuals with that those systems are starting to dominate, and I think we'll see that sort of pattern continue in that way.
Interesting. Wow. I know you've mentioned that before, but good to see it being studied and in a real life situation. Yeah, thanks for that, man. We didn't mention it before, but we're going to get to an interview now. You spoke a little bit ago, or a little while ago, with Jose Areta. What was this talk
Mhm.
about, and how did it go?
So he released a paper. He's from Liverpool John Moores University here. The interview went well. He's a lovely guy. I met him at the London Marathon Conference last year. And so his paper was called Endocrine, Metabolic, and Skeletal Muscle Proteomic Responses During Energy Deficit with Concomitant Aerobic Exercise in Humans. Basically, they gave people low calories and got them to exercise, and then we saw what happened as a result of it. So you're looking at like, what happens to muscle when we're in an energy deficit and we keep trying to exercise? Is really the question they try to answer, which is really interesting. It's got lots of implications, I think, uh, for our understanding more than anything else. So I think listeners will get quite a bit out of it. It's a little bit technical, but stick around because at the end we'll review you and I will review this, and I'll sort of give some takeaways as well there.
Well, without further ado, let's go to Jose Areta.
Jose Areta is an associate professor in exercise metabolism and nutrition at Liverpool John Moores University, currently specializing in the endocrine, metabolic, and physiological effects of low energy availability and how these may affect performance. Jose originally trained as a biologist, earning his MSc equivalent in biology with a zoology minor from Universidad Nacional de La Plata. Following this, during his PhD at RMIT in Australia, he specialized in sports nutrition. He then went on to do his postdoc research at the Norwegian School of Sports Sciences, where he investigated the dynamics of skeletal muscle glycogen use during exercise and the interaction between muscle glycogen and acute changes in energy availability on training adaptation. In addition to all this, he works with elite athletes as an applied practitioner and consultant in sports nutrition, and being a lifelong athlete himself, holds a black belt in Taekwondo and competed nationally in road cycling. Jose, welcome to the 1% Better podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Dave. Thank you so much for having me here. Pleasure to be here with you.
And we met originally at the London Marathon Conference last year. And at the time, we had a fairly in depth discussion around a number of things, including what we'll talk about today. And you sort of hinted that this paper might be coming out. So when I saw it come out, I jumped on it, read it very quickly, and then reached out to you to come on. So the paper itself is called Endocrine, Metabolic, and Skeletal Muscle Proteomic Responses During Energy Deficit with Concomitant Aerobic Exercise in Humans. And that'll be the center of our discussion today. But I think, given your background, a lot of what we'll be talking about is kind of energy availability and sort of, I guess, adaptation to exercise in that context. So I guess to set the scene, can you explain a little bit about, I guess, what you did with the paper and sort of broad brushstroke?
Yeah. So as you said, my area of work is around the modulation of training adaptation by manipulation of the intake of macronutrients like carbohydrate, fat, and protein, and that's sort of what I've been studying since my PhD, which is a good decade and a half ago since it started. So we've been doing this for a number of years. And as my interest in this area progressed, I saw that the area of like what happens to the body with energy deficit, how it adapts, is a really fascinating area, which it appears that we know quite a lot about it, but in reality I don't think we know as much as we think we do. And one of the topics that I think it's quite prominent around how the body adapts to energy deficit is what happens to skeletal muscle, and that's sort of what we studied in this research paper. um, I want to put this in context as well, like historically a little bit maybe,
Please, yeah.
because we know quite a bit about what happens when females are exposed to energy deficit because of a historical perspective on in the 80s there was this discovery that females that participated in sport, they lost their menstrual cycle and they had tended to have like more bone stress injuries and so on. And because of that, the focus historically has been on females, which is probably the only area in sports science that does a little bit more research in females than in males, because
I was just thinking that, yeah.
Yeah, it's very unbalanced, and we are trying to do more work in females, but this one area, we don't know a lot about how men respond to like low energy availability or energy deficit. And I'm just going to use those terms as equivalent in this conversation. So one of the things that we don't know much about, as I was saying before, is like how skeletal muscle responds to energy deficit. And we also don't know what happens, to males in terms of like how their endocrine milieu responds to energy deficit. So the idea of this study was to do an in-depth analysis of what happens to skeletal muscle when individuals keep exercising and doing aerobic type exercise, as well as what happens in the hormonal responses and like metabolic responses, and that is what we studied using a typical experimental protocol for these type of studies in low energy availability. But we use a really advanced technique for the assessment of the skeletal muscle response. We did use a technique that is called dynamic proteomic profiling that allows us to look into the responses of skeletal muscle in a sort of protein by protein basis. So what we can look at is like hundreds of proteins that exist in the muscle and how the synthesis rates change. So how quick those proteins are being added by using of tracers, in this case, deuterated water or D2O. As well as we can see the absolute amount of those proteins, if there's more or less. And this technique gives us a degree of granularity that is not common in the area. Typically, when we look at muscle protein synthesis, and I've done studies during my PhD about what happens with energy deficit and muscle protein synthesis, we typically look at it from a perspective of what happens to the myofibrillar fraction. So a really big sort of pool of proteins, which doesn't give us a degree of like what's happening qualitatively in the muscle. But with this study, the exciting part is that we can start looking at it how the quality of the muscle changes.
Yeah, I think so thank you for clearing some of that up. I read this study like probably 4 or 5 times in preparation for this, and some of that was a little bit unclear to me. So that's been very helpful. So thank you so much for that. And in terms of what you did, just for listeners, you had a study group of 10 males. The VO2 max was roughly around 57. That they weren't overweight is probably a key factor here as well. They had 18% on average body fat, and I think that's really important. You then had 3 conditions. I guess you had 15 days consecutive. You sort of had 15 days of free living, 15 days of controlled eating in a caloric balance, and then 5 days. 5 days free living, 5 days controlled balance, and then 5 days where they had an energy deficit of 78%. So like enormous energy deficit. And during that 5-day window, during that, was it the 5-day window? They did 3 sessions of 90 minutes. Yeah. So in the 5-day window, they did 3 sessions of 90 minutes at 60% of VO2 max. That's all correct, isn't it?
Yeah, that's all correct. Yeah. So basically, in the study, what we did, as you said, like 3 consecutive 5-day periods where the first 5 days were just to see what the individuals did in their day-to-day life, sort of thing. And we knew these people were not like overweight or untrained, and the amount of exercise that we asked them to do was something that they would be accustomed to doing. So it was not like a really novel stimulus for them.
Yep.
Because what we wanted to test mainly is like what happens is when you take energy out while they keep exercising. But one of the reasons that why the study is relatively short, like 5 days, is because we controlled everything. So it's a very, very well controlled study. We gave them every single meal. We got them to exercise in the lab, so we knew exactly how much exercise they were doing, the intensity of which they were doing. We were measuring respiratory gases while they were doing exercise. We took blood samples throughout the study, and we took like muscle biopsies before and after each phase, so we could like do the relevant assessments. And the energy deficit was on purpose quite severe, because this is a sort of proof of principle study. We wanted to see what's happening, so we are purposefully doing an intervention that gives us a strong physiological response. And this might not be something that has 100% ecological validity, but it allows us to see mechanisms.
Yeah, I think as well, it's very easy for people to read a paper and sort of poke holes in it and say, oh, it was only 5 days, or it was, the deficit was too big. But I think I like to bring context here, especially talking to researchers around things like logistics, right? Like logistically asking someone to come into the lab and do everything they had done to them, like that doesn't last more than 15 days. Like it is so hard to get done. You would just get no participants, right? I recently had to say no to somebody as a research participant down the road here, because the commute time was a bit long for the number of times they needed me to come and the duration they needed me to be there. So that's just
Yeah.
the reality. And I'm passionate about supporting research. I wanted to go do this research study. I found it interesting. It was all good, but I was like, actually, I can't commit to this. And those are the things that we're trying to balance here. So one of the questions I had for later was just a rough ballpark figure, if you can remember, and if you're allowed to share, of what a study like this would cost, because I think it would be quite instructive for people to understand the magnitude of outlay that comes here, just from a financial standpoint. We're not even talking about man hours and what that costs, because time is worth money as well. But do you have a rough idea of what the study cost?
Yeah, so the original funding that we got to get this study was of around like £85,000,
Yep.
and that's without taking into account, some of very very important sort of input on like man hours, like provided by
Yep.
the university as well. So it's hard to come up with an exact figure, like what's the final cost of the study, but it would be like higher than that if you accounted every
Yeah.
minute of each person, that contributed to it.
Yeah. And then roughly what was the duration, again, just to give people some context here, duration from like beginning of recruitment to the beginning of, say, writing it up. Do you have a rough idea of that?
Yeah, so this has been about 4 or 5 years of work.
Yep.
Yeah, so this been a project that I've been focusing on for a while, and it's been really challenging logistics wise as well, because we started it. I mean, we got the grant to do this like during COVID,
Yep.
and we were the first people going in the lab to run the trials and so on, and that was a very very challenging time.
Yeah.
The PhD student at the time that was doing it, he put a huge amount of work that in like to be able to pull that off, and do the trials and so on. So that was particularly difficult, and then all the logistical challenges that came after that. So I'm sure it could have been completed in a shorter period of time, but because of the like a number of challenges, like just dragged on for longer than we wanted it to. But I'm glad that we got it done in the end, and it required like a lot of time of analysis as well, because the proteomics data set is so complex that it just requires a lot of time of like going through lists of proteins and understanding and reading and going back to it, and making sense of a huge amount of data that you read it with a in a way that you say, oh yeah, this story makes sense, but at the beginning you get like
Yeah.
a lot of numbers that you go like, how can I make sense of this? So yeah.
Yeah. And then just again, you made a really good point at the beginning that I'd overlooked, around this being the only area of research where we probably have more female data than male data. But just again, for context, I think it would be helpful for listeners. Do you have a rough sense of what it would cost you to have included 10 women here? So it wouldn't be double, because it would be probably a little bit, well, maybe it would be around double, because you'd have to control for menstrual cycle phase as well, which is the significant cost associated with including like women in research, is properly measuring and therefore controlling for the menstrual cycle. Do you have any sense of what that would cost, or not really?
Not really, because the way that we have these protocols set up doesn't really allow for control of the menstrual cycle. I'd say I'd say simply is double, but
Yep.
things don't scale like that in research.
Yep.
Sometimes having twice as many participants is not twice the expense, is maybe less or more depending on the study and
Yeah.
the specific situations in which you're doing the study, but it would have been a lot more time, that's for sure.
Yeah, that was my gut. Was it was going to be less than double just because of scale, but then probably double because of having to track, at least measure menstrual hormones, right? Just to and aligning timelines. But
Yeah, we typically struggle to get female participants more than we struggle to get male
yeah,
participants for. I don't know what the reason is, but and this is not quantified. But when it comes to like running female specific studies, which we've done, we just finished one now. Um, yeah, it's not easy.
yeah, no, I just think it's an important point that it's very easy, and the whole industry loves to talk about we don't have enough female studies, and that's a very very well made point. But the realities of that, I think, are overlooked, and the difficulties around it. So I wanted to sort of bring that into light quickly. But back to the
Yeah.
study, um, we sort of talked about what was done. I guess at a high level, how would you summarize your findings? Like, what would be your like sort of the main takeaways for this for listeners? I guess.
So, spoiler, I think the
Yeah,
the results are really interesting.
I agree. I
So,
agree. I
yeah,
find this to be
uh,
really interesting, and we're going to keep. Don't worry, this isn't the end of the podcast. We're going to keep going afterwards. We've got many more questions, but I think outlining the study so that people know what was done and then what was found at a high level, and then we can dig in will be great.
yeah. So, to say, what's important, again, I need to put things in context a little bit.
Please, please.
One of the ideas that typically people have around, energy deficit and skeletal muscle is that energy deficit equals a sub, so I say like suboptimal skeletal muscle response. We have studied this in the past as well, and we've seen that by reducing energy deficit by around 30% or so for only a few days, it decreases myofibrillary protein synthesis. But we know also that exercise can rescue that decrease in myofibrillary protein synthesis. But there is this idea that okay, when you're in energy deficit, your muscles tend not to grow, and that might lead to a worse sort of physiological response. However, as I was saying before, these studies don't really give this sort of granular analysis of what's happening qualitatively in the muscle. And so, what we saw in this study, which was quite fascinating, is the fact that when we exposed these male individuals to like 5 days of very low energy availability, that they had a very clear response to energy deficit. In those 3 days, they lost around 3 kilos of body weight. Then, when we look at markers of what we call energy preservation, so endocrine markers, hormones that indicate that the body is having a sort of an endocrine physiological response to energy deficit, they did what we expected them to do. Like leptin went down, T3 went down, IGF-1 went down, P1NP, which is a marker of collagen formation, went down. And then we'll go like, well, yeah, the intervention is having the effect that we're expecting it to have. But when we look at that skeletal muscle, we see that myofibrillary protein synthesis of the muscle that was exercising, these individuals were like on a bike, on an ergometer, the myofibrillary protein synthesis didn't change, and sarcoplasmic protein synthesis, so the proteins that are sort of floating around in the muscle cell, didn't change, but the mitochondrial proteins, the protein synthesis, the absolute protein synthesis went up. So instead of going down, instead of the muscle sort of shutting down, it seems that the muscle is upregulating the machinery that allows it to oxidize, fats and carbohydrates. So the machinery that generates energy. So that is not shutting down; it's still like going up. And then when we do like a more granular analysis, we see that proteins of key pathways of the mitochondria are upregulated as well, of the electron transport chain, the TCA cycle, and the beta oxidation of the mitochondria. So all these are important pathways that regulate or are associated to or part of the energy generating machinery of muscle.
Yeah, and I guess I think I hate saying this makes sense evolutionarily. I hate leaning on that, but if we take that lens to it, and I know you've come from a zoology background, you spent time in animal studies, this would make some sense contextually, given that we were hunter gatherers, and I know you alluded to this in the paper. As a hunter gatherer, you kind of need to be able to hunt and gather when there's low energy. So preserving muscle function and preserving mitochondrial function, or indeed upregulating it, would be helpful in that context. And so evolutionarily, it would have probably been selected for, as opposed
Yeah,
to being downregulated. Um,
yeah.
with respect to the energy deficit, the fat free mass loss. So you mentioned 3 kilos of muscle of mass loss, and then there was about 2 kilos of fat free mass loss.
Yeah.
This is something that I know you've highlighted as a key part of the paper, sort of in the discussion. What do you put down that fat-free mass loss to? Is it other muscle atrophy and that the non-working muscles, say upper body, or is it glycogen loss and we're just measuring it as fat-free mass loss? Where do you think it's coming from?
Yeah, so we measured body composition with two different techniques, with
Yep.
an assessment that is called like DEXA, which I'm sure
Yep.
your listeners are familiar with, which is doing like a sort of a small exposure to ionizing radiation that allows you to see that the sort of different tissues in like a three compartment model, like um, uh, bone, fat mass, and fat-free mass, so we can see how much of that there is and there's after. So we cannot really distinguish muscle from non-muscle. And the other
Yep.
technique that we use is a bioelectrical impedance, which tends to be a very low quality assessment typically, but we have a really good piece of equipment to do bioelectrical impedance, BIA, which is quite precise, and this allows us to look at also don't really look at like muscle, but we can look at changes in like body composition, especially what we have there that the DEXA doesn't allow you to see is changes in body water.
Yep.
So we cannot say there's been a decrease in muscle mass. There might have been a little bit. What we know for sure is that there was a very significant decrease in total body water of about
Mm-hmm.
1.2 kilos. So of those 2 kilos of the 2.1 kilos of like fat-free mass, around 1.2 is body water, which is quite normal. There's like these fluid shifts when people are exposed acutely to significant energy deficit. A good part of the early weight loss is from just fluid, which doesn't mean that people are like losing muscle as such, like protein from muscle.
Yep.
When we did an analysis of the amount of fat-free mass in legs and arms and so on before and after, there were no significant changes, because we can do that assessment of like the different parts of the body of like, okay, let's look at what happens in arms and legs and so on. We didn't see
Yep.
any changes there. So the arms were like non-active muscle, let's say. They were not
Yep.
doing exercise, but to summarize it, there was a decrease in around 0.8 kilograms of fat mass on average. And when we subtract the amount of water from the fat-free mass, and we multiply that amount of mass by the energy equivalent of that mass, so uh, a kilo of fat mass would be around 9,000 calories, and then
Yep.
around 4,500 calories for a kilo of fat-free mass. If you look at those energy equivalents multiplied by the mass, when you take out the amount of body water, then the contribution of energy to that energy deficit by looking at the changes in those tissues, the vast majority of energy is coming from fat. So around 80% of the energy is coming from fat, if that makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And this is why we were talking offline before. You were talking about sort of the importance of basic science and the mechanistic understanding, and this speaks to exactly that, because there's any number of people making a ton of noise around muscle loss with, whether it's GLP-1s, which I know you allude to in the paper, or whether it's just weight loss in general. And I think your point's really well made, which is a lot of that concern is probably water, and there's probably an amount of glycogen that goes with it, just by virtue of the metabolism that goes there, and that will liberate water. So, and that will, if you use only DEXA, that will probably show up as muscle loss, because some of that will come from within the muscle, and the muscle's volume will change, which is how DEXA works. So I think if we use first principles, the study is really illustrative to how we're actually losing mass, and it's not as bad perhaps as everyone thinks it is, which is something you highlighted really clearly in the paper, which I thought was great there.
Yeah. Again, like we're measuring fat-free mass, and there's a lot of things that are fat-free mass that are not muscle. Importantly, organ mass, is fat-free mass, and that might change as well. There's evidence to show that organ sizes might change with energy deficit. I don't know if they change in this study, but it might as well be.
Yeah. One thing I had as a question, and this might speak to like my poor understanding of the paper, so please excuse me if that was the case. It looked as though, as you said, mitochondria and muscle were sort of prioritized, if we'll call it that, without wanting to anthropomorphize the body too much. But that collagen, and I guess in that context, you were talking about extracellular matrix around the muscle and muscle quality, but was there also an aspect of tendon in that collagen? And is there a sort of trade-off with tendons versus, say, muscles and mitochondria?
Yeah. So to bring the listener up to speed, because this is something that I didn't mention. So there were two key responses in skeletal muscle to energy deficit. One of them was an increase in the mitochondrial sort of proteins, and the other one was a complex modulation of some extracellular matrix proteins. Now, many of the proteins that were reduced, so there was a reduction of many proteins, and some of them increased. The majority decreased in amount in muscle. They were all related. There were collagen or collagen-related proteins. Now, it took me a while to make sense of these data, and went like, well, what does this mean? Like, and then I had to do like tons of reading, and try to understand, okay, what is happening here, and what happened really, we are not measuring tendons as such. What we are looking at is we take a muscle biopsy from the vastus lateralis of the quadriceps, and in between the muscle cells, there is this extracellular matrix that is sort of binding the proteins together. The muscle cells together. This is a rather important part of the muscle, and muscle tends to respond positively to training with the structure and the amount of collagen that is synthesized and so on. But also there is an effect of aging on the accumulation of excessive collagen in skeletal muscle. So there's some evidence in monkeys showing that monkeys that are provided diets ad libitum, like as much as they want throughout their life, compared to monkeys that are energy restricted, they have a lot of inclusions of collagen in the muscle, which is called like skeletal muscle fibrosis, which is the inclusion of collagen in places where it shouldn't be, and the muscle looks like sort of marbled kind of thing. Like instead of being, if you look at the cross-sectional area of the muscle, it's not all contractile area, but you have inclusions of collagen. So the way that we look at this is that the energy deficit might be having an effect of like reducing those proteins that might accumulate with aging. I mean, these were like young individuals that participated in the study, but the way in which these collagen proteins are going is sort of the same direction that is been evidenced in monkeys before. So we sort of make that link. Whether would this have a sort of a negative effect if repeated over time, with this degree of severity in energy deficit? I really don't know. We don't have that evidence, and this level of energy deficit would be unsustainable anyway. So you wouldn't expose anyone to this. But I am not 100% sure about links between energy deficit and injuries in muscle related to like tendon. But that would be interesting to investigate.
Yeah. I guess you sort of headed off one of my questions, which is kind of how long do you think the observed pattern would last? And I think that the simple answer there is at 78% energy deficit, not long, because the organism probably doesn't last very long.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe do you think this a similar pattern would happen with a prolonged period of a lesser energy deficit, perhaps?
Yeah, I suspect that we do observe something similar, and something that we have to keep in mind here is that we don't have to fall into this like good or bad type thinking, because biological systems are quite complex. I think that we need to describe what is happening, and then interpret it depending the context.
Yep.
And I think it's quite important that we realize as well that some techniques have limitations. As much as this technique is great because it allows us to see the changes in protein with an incredible degree of granularity, we don't know where those proteins are located. For example, what's exactly happening in terms of like the structure of those proteins. What we saw, it was an increase of proteins of the dystrophin associated protein complex, which is a there are proteins that are on the membrane of the skeletal muscle that sort of bind the skeletal muscle to that extracellular matrix. So there might be a compensatory change of some other proteins of the extracellular matrix that are still like strengthening the extracellular matrix. So, but we don't have, we didn't do, unfortunately, histology of this study or histochemistry that could give more granular detail into that. But what these findings show us is that this is a part of the muscle that is very responsive to energy deficit, and we should probably keep investigating what's happening to that part of the muscle, so that this opens a door to investigate something that has typically been neglected quite a bit when it comes to skeletal muscle biology and the effect of energy deficit in muscle.
Yeah, well, I think you're sort of leading me down to one of my next questions, which was when your good researchers usually have this is step whatever within my story, and there's going to be a step next one and a next one and next one, provided depending on what we see, right? And I think you've made the good point that we kind of opened the door towards investigating what happens in muscle more closely using these techniques, perhaps with energy deficits, perhaps with different types of training. And so I guess what is the next step, or have you already started it? And what's the next step and what's on the wish list?
Yeah. So I suppose there's like a number of things to be done, at, different populations at the different levels and so on. I think, one of the things that is very important is to be able to differentiate the effect of energy deficit using no exercise versus using exercise. And I think that
Yep.
the response of muscle would be quite different. Generally, like biological systems respond to the sort of principle use it or lose it.
Yep.
And I think this gets accelerated in energy deficit. When it comes to preserving energy, if something is not being used or is not of high priority for survival, then that the response would be quite different. So I'd say that someone that is not exercising and has the stress of energy deficit on its own, like muscles might not do what we saw that what was happening when they were exercising. So that would be a next step. We have some samples that are sort of being analyzed that are getting a bit delayed because of like some problems with equipment, but we have done a similar intervention, slightly different protocol. I think it's a stronger experimental design, like a randomized sort of crossover design, looking at the independent effect of sort of carbohydrates. Well, kind of independent, basically having this same group of people doing twice a similar intervention to this one with a little bit more exercise, but with in energy balance with a normal sort of high-ish carbohydrate diet, versus one where they're in energy balance but they have a high fat, low carbohydrate diet, trying to
Oh,
see
interesting.
whether it's, you know, the ratio between carbohydrates and fat that might be driving that, or the subtraction of carbohydrates, basically, because there's been much research over the years on, you know, acute responses on skeletal muscle to training with low muscle glycogen, and we're kind of like looking into that a little bit.
Yeah.
So we have all the hormones for that ready, and, you know, we still need the all the proteomics
Proteomics.
data, which
Yeah.
is taking some time. So I think those things would be key. And then, of course, we need to look into, well, we have to think about, well, do we want to go down the path of applying this research to, you know, to elite athletes, and we want to see what's happening um, on an elite athlete, or do we want to go down the path of let's study sort of general, you know, overweight, obese populations? And, you know, they are sort of different populations that they might have like slightly different responses. So I honestly think that the basic biological mechanisms would be very, very similar, but the demands on an elite athlete are very different from the daily demands of a overweight or person with obesity.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, that these are like important questions in terms of like, the important populations to study, but we also need to have a better idea of not only what's happening at the molecular level, because I think it's essential that we understand mechanisms, but we also need to look at the end point, which is the effect on physical capacity.
Yeah.
So we can hypothesize a lot about what happens, you know, when this protein changes and that protein changes, or that gene is activated or not. But at the end of the day, what we really care about is like, is the capacity of someone to do X, Y, or Z movement impaired or improved by, you know, having this type of intervention. And, you know, there's been much talk about how energy deficit is detrimental for performance, particularly fueled around from, you know, all the ideas around reds and all that. But in reality, there's no solid evidence to show causality between a decrease in energy and the effect on performance. I mean, we know that if you are not giving someone enough carbohydrates, that most likely is going to have a negative effect on performance. But, you know, like a sort of milder, prolonged energy deficit, we don't really
Yeah.
know what the effect on performance is. And people are, you know, talking about this adaptable versus how do
Yeah.
you say,
Non
problematic
adaptive. Yeah.
low energy availability, which for me is nonsense, because it doesn't work like that. You know, you might see sort of negative effects as at the same time that you see positive, so you cannot really differentiate one of the other, or let alone that you cannot measure energy availability in the field. But you know, it's quite complex. But I think that some athletes are very much at the limit of their capacity, and they are still able to perform at the, you know, the highest level, and win the best races, you know, when they are in energy deficit. So whether that's having a negative effect or a positive one is difficult to define. Like if you look at the latest female Tour de France winner, or what she did in terms of like weight loss and the
Yep.
performance and so on. And you say, well, that was rather problematic because she was not having a great time doing it, but at the same time, she won the race. So it is a bit of it's a complex scenario. So you cannot really differentiate adaptable from problematic. It can be both at the same time, or none of them.
Yeah. And would that be different if it was a 3-week race, not a 9-day race? Right. And so all those questions come to mind. So there's a lot there for sure. I guess one of the last questions I had was what you observed was with respect to aerobic exercise. Do you think that'd be different from a more high intensity or even like a strength type of exercise? Or do you think it's probably just any stimulus rather than no stimulus, I guess?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think that the muscle probably will tend to acquire a more of an oxidative phenotype, and this is me hypothesizing and based on
Yep.
other data and so on. There's been um, some studies showing that around 10% body weight loss in people with obesity show an increase of myosin heavy chain type, myosin heavy chain 1, that is a slow contracting myosin heavy chain. And we sort of saw something similar, which is not particularly highlighted in the study, because there were so many things that we could
Yeah.
say, but we had to keep it like rather succinct. But my suspicion is that the body most likely has adaptations that might be more favorable towards an oxidative phenotype. Um, Now it's hard to say without having the participants uh, do any type of explosive work or like weightlifting or anything like that. But I think that if it has a negative effect or if it has a positive effect, it might be leaning more towards some sort of aerobic component.
Yeah.
And that's again going back to what we hypothesized, that you know uh, the body allocates energy to things that are essential for survival. Movement is very important for survival, and because our hunter-gatherer heritage, where we have to like find food, hunt food, the thing that might be prioritized was that capacity of endure,
Yeah.
of the pursuit of long distance movement and so on. So rather than the short-term explosive response. So that's me hypothesizing, but I think that the muscle would still be very much responsive, and we've shown that before in doing this sort of more generic myofibrillar protein synthesis response, that if you do weights type training, that you tend to retain more muscle mass than you would do um, if you didn't do weights training. And if you eat protein, that muscle grows. And we know from other studies as well is that your muscle might shrink if you're in energy deficit, severe energy deficit. There's a really cool meta-analysis by Karsten Köhler showing that when individuals are exposed to more than 500 kilocalories per kilo, no, sorry, more than 500 kilocalories per day, they tend to lose fat-free mass. But if they keep doing weight training, they keep getting stronger regardless of the decreases in muscle mass. And that's go back to what I was saying before. Like, we have to think about the quality of the muscle, and the changes in key metrics that are related to performance, like strength and endurance and so on.
Yeah, and I think that would make sense in the context of strength is a large portion neurological, right? So losing a couple
Yeah.
of myofibrils is probably not going to be a big deal. And similarly, to your point around the oxidative maintenance or movement towards an oxidative phenotype, we were persistence hunters, right? That's how we evolved, and so we were not faster than anything, and we weren't stronger than anything, but we could endure more than everything. So that again would, without wanting to anthropomorphize too much, or hark back to evolution too much, it would make some evolutionary sense. But that's been so great, Jose. I really appreciate it. There's a lot here for listeners to take. I think there's lots of insights here, and we'll be following along closely to see the next evolutions of the study. And I reserve the right to ask you back on. I like doing this to people on air, so they feel obliged to say yes and to join us again to talk more about their research. But it's been so great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was and it will be a pleasure, Dave, in the future. So thank you for having me. And I hope your audience enjoys our chat.
Of course.
David, thanks so much for getting together with Jose and having that chat with him. Should we do a quick review of what you guys were talking about?
Yeah, so I guess firstly, thanks again to Jose. It was great. And he was really keen to put things in context. And I think he did a good job of that. I wanted to provide some context afterwards. I spoke to him about it after the interview as well. And he was very keen for me to do this. So I guess, firstly, if you think about what he said, which is fundamentally, we may get positive adaptations to our mitochondria and muscle as a result of these sort of practices, which is exercising and cutting calories. If you think about that, that may be part of why we see people get into trouble with underfueling, because for a short period of time, it may be beneficial. And so that creates a bit of a flywheel or a self-perpetuating system, and then they keep underfueling and then they end up in problems. Right? So that's that's the first thing I'd say here. So the second thing I'd say is anybody looking to lose weight and perform concurrently should be working with a professional. It's the second thing I would say here, and it's really important. The third thing here is they, self-admittedly, we talked about it on the podcast and in the paper, it's noted in, it's very clearly noted, they did not assess performance here. It's really important to remember, we do not take measures of your mitochondrial function on the start line and give you a medal if you've got the highest. It's who finishes first, and we don't know what happened to performance in this context. And performance is always multifaceted and complex. So I also wanted to point people back to 20th of December last year. We did a podcast with Professor Alex Coates on Does Red S Exist? And that was in response to a paper that Jose was a author on. And he sort of alludes to this a little bit in the podcast. He gets a little bit ranty, which I loved, talking about this. And he discussed the paper a little bit there. And basically, the context is Red S, probably people are aware of it, right? Which is this relative energy deficiency in sport. It's a syndrome. You end up with it, you end up with these problems. All good. The author team's argument and Jose's viewpoint is that energetic stresses are just another stressor. We have all these other stresses, and that energetic stresses, right? So underfueling very rarely happens in a vacuum. Perhaps the only one that I've ever heard of to some degree is Clara Koppenberg that we talked about. But even there, she was training a lot as well. So it's not a single stressor. And she was stressing about performance. So there's psychological stress. So even there, we're not talking about energy stress in a vacuum. And so his point is that because of that, it's an unscientific thing to say that it's only the energy. My take on all of this personally, and this is not necessarily supported by evidence, it's my synthesis of the evidence. And I'd be, again, I'm open to being wrong on all this, is that all of this is a stress, and we look at the single biggest stress and then call it the syndrome that we're dealing with. If we think that it's a training issue, then we call it overtraining. If we think that it's a fueling issue, we call it Red S. And there are certainly components that are distinct in those contexts to some degree. But I don't think any of these exist in a vacuum, because stress doesn't exist in a vacuum. We have emotional stress and psychological stress and whatever. And if you look at things like the research on exam periods, and I've experienced this myself in students, the injury rate goes up. All right. So it's never, we're a complex system that doesn't exist in a vacuum. So I'd also point to, Jose's point is that there's not a lot of evidence for Red S existing in terms of its etiology, what causes it, other than there is an energy deficit. He doesn't believe that's necessarily driving it, but there is an energy deficit. We have all this sequelae. Now, the other thing to remember, and he would agree with this, is that a lack of evidence isn't evidence to refute the existence of it. His claim is that there's no evidence to support it, not that, it's certainly never going to be the case. So it's worthwhile noting that as well.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for putting it together. When you talk about anyone looking to lose weight and perform concurrently should be working with a professional, I just thought immediately of this year's Tour de France winner, Pauline Ferrand-Prévot. She was criticized for having lost a lot of weight, and the first thing she said was it was done in a very controlled environment, working together with professionals alongside her, who made sure she didn't go over the limit. So interesting that you say that. But thanks again for putting that together. Appreciated. Doctor's office this week. Hannah Williams is in the doctor's office. Who is she?
Yeah, so this came across my social media timeline. I'd never heard of Hannah Williams. My apologies. So she's a former British 200-meter champion, and had to retire from her sport because of what they called anaerobic exercise-induced kidney failure. And I was like, I've never heard of this. So I've heard of rhabdomyolysis. It's generally more endurance sport, excessive endurance sport. You end up with breaking down muscle. The myoglobin blocks the kidneys and you can go into renal failure. You get urine that looks like Coke. I was like, okay, well, let's look this up. And I started looking it up. And what I could find looks slightly different to the article, right? So in terms of what she said in the article, and we'll sort of come to that in a second. But what I found was acute renal failure with severe loin pain. And the loin is kind of in your kidney region. So the sort of back corner of your back, let's call it that, back bottom corner. Loin pain and patchy renal ischemia after. So it's acute renal failure with loin pain, severe loin pain, and patchy renal ischemia after anaerobic exercise. The acronym here is ALPE. So the A for acute renal failure, the L for loin, the P for patchy, and the E for exercise. Welcome to medicine, where everything's an acronym. Anyway, so there are two types of exercise-associated renal failure. We already talked about it. One is a sort of long-known myoglobinuria, which is the myoglobin breakdown, induced renal failure due to severe rhabdomyolysis. That's the one I talked about. And we usually think about that as rhabdomyolysis and the sequelae being renal failure. This is what causes renal failure, rhabdomyolysis. Right? So slightly backwards, but it's the same pathology. The other is the recently recognized non-myoglobinuria induced ARF, which is acute renal failure with mild rhabdomyolysis, which is probably more this is what I thought she had. The disease process is distinct from rhabdomyolysis in that creatine kinase levels are not significantly elevated. So you'll see creatine kinase go up with muscle damage. You'll see it high after a marathon, etc. So it's an indication of muscle breakdown. Myoglobinuria, so you're not peeing out myoglobin, is not seen. And aggressive fluid resuscitation is not beneficial. So that's, when you have rhabdomyolysis, they generally give you a bunch of fluid. This is 90% in men and most commonly after repeated 200 meters. So I thought maybe this was her. But if you read the article that was, I think it was on Athletics Weekly that I read this, there was some other stuff in there. She was talking about lactic acid buildup and it causing spasm of her renal tubules. The arterioles in and out of the kidney. I can't make heads or tails on what she was talking about. I couldn't find anything on PubMed or anything like that. So my gut is this is probably what she had and she's misunderstood it. But she also really struggled to get a diagnosis, had to go to sports doctors and all sorts of stuff. So maybe it's even more rare than what I read about, which is pretty rare because I'd never heard of it before. So, take what you want there. We use the doctor's office to try and learn a little bit and sort of explain some stuff to people. I'm not sure I learned something. I hope others learned something. I'm not sure I explained what she was going through there, but best wishes to her. And I think she's gone on to a modeling career, so she's doing okay, which is cool.
Interesting. Wow, thanks for finding that. Before we get out of here, what are we watching this weekend?
It's probably Valencia, mate. Valencia Marathon's coming up, so might do that. I think it's this weekend. Might be wrong. It's the 7th. Is it next weekend?
It's next weekend.
Next weekend.
That's what I thought, yeah. I thought we mentioned that. Yeah, I actually weirdly remembered that date from last week's episode. So you're not watching Valencia Marathon this weekend?
I might just tune into the stream a week early and see how we go. I'm not too sure, mate. Not sure. I mean, I'll be in Amsterdam, so I might not be watching much at all, actually. So it'll be good. Be a nice little weekend away.
Same. I'll be in Spain, so not much TV for me. I'll be listening to pro cyclists complain why they have to go out tomorrow morning for another photo shoot, even though most of them have been professionals for 10 years and they know the schedule by now and they know this is what you do as a professional athlete. But they know complaining.
I will say this, knowing that some of them listen to this podcast, and I would say this to everybody: you are not paid, and this is everybody's job. This is not about professional athletes. There are the bits of the job you like. For them, that's riding the bike, right? They would ride the bike anyway, for the most part. That's not what you're paid for. You're paid for the bit of the job you hate. So they're paid to do the media and, not get into trouble at night and whatever else. So they're paid to behave, paid to whatever. So it's worthwhile remembering that in your job. You're probably not paid to do the bit you like. You're probably paid to do the bit you hate, like the email or the paperwork or the whatever else.
Yeah. Well put. Very good perspective for sure. Thank you so much for downloading, streaming, listening to this episode. We appreciate every single one of you. Please subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so yet. It helps us grow a great deal, and we can't do this without you. David, thanks so much for putting this together. Appreciate it. And we will catch you on next week. We publish a new episode every single Friday morning.
Thanks, mate. Talk soon.